When Tom's text came through at 2:17 a.m., I was already awake, staring at the ceiling of our Seattle home. Mia will be staying at the Lake Tahoe house this summer. I've moved some of my things there. I think we need space. Don't try contacting me for a while. I read it twice, the blue light illuminating my face in the darkness of our bedroom. Poor Tom. He had no idea I'd already changed the deed 6 months ago, and his girlfriend was about to get a very unpleasant surprise. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I set my phone on the nightstand, its glow catching the edge of my wedding band. 14 years of marriage reduced to a middle-of-the-night text message. Not even a phone call. I supposed I should have felt something, rage perhaps, or heartbreak. Instead, I felt a curious sense of calm, like watching the final piece of a complex puzzle slide perfectly into place. Outside, the Seattle rain tapped gently against the windows of our Magnolia home, a rhythmic counterpoint to my steady breathing. The city lights blurred through the raindrops, creating a watercolor landscape of our view over Puget Sound. I'd always loved how the house caught the morning light, especially in the kitchen where I'd spent countless hours perfecting recipes. While Tom worked late, I poured myself a glass of the 30-year Macallan he'd been saving for a special occasion. This certainly qualified. The amber liquid caught the low light as I swirled it gently, savoring both the moment and the irony. When we met, I was finishing my law degree at Stanford, while Tom was already established in his architectural firm. He'd found my legal knowledge cute, but ultimately unnecessary for the life he envisioned for us. He never bothered to discover that before law school, I'd specialized in real estate and property law at one of the most prestigious firms in California. The first sign had come 18 months ago, a credit card statement showing a reservation at an exclusive restaurant in San Francisco on a night Tom claimed to be meeting clients in Portland. Standard cliché, really. I might have dismissed it as a one-time indiscretion if not for the reservation being for 2 rooms at the St. Regis, one under his name, one under Rebecca Chang. When confronted, he'd spun a convincing story about a last-minute client change and his assistant booking separate rooms as company policy. I took a slow sip of the scotch, letting it burn a warm path down my throat. Our home was silent, except for the gentle patter of rain and the distant hum of a late-night ferry crossing the Sound. I'd spent the past year building my case, moving through our marriage like a ghost, present but somehow invisible to Tom, who was too preoccupied with his new relationship to notice the subtle shifts in my behavior. The second warning had come when I noticed Tom had created a new email account. He'd used our shared laptop and forgotten to log out, a small mistake. But in marriages like ours, small mistakes were often the only window into the truth. The emails revealed communications with attorneys specializing in property division and offshore asset protection. There were detailed inquiries about Washington state divorce laws and questions about maintaining ownership of vacation properties in other states. I hadn't confronted him then either. Instead, I'd photographed everything, logged out, and begun my own research. If Tom was planning a strategic divorce, he would find himself outmaneuvered at every turn. Our Lake Tahoe vacation home had always been Tom's pride and joy. A stunning 4-bedroom A-frame overlooking the crystal-clear water, nestled among the pines on the Nevada side of the lake. We'd purchased it 7 years ago as an investment property, but it had quickly become our favorite retreat. Tom had designed several renovations himself, expanding the deck and adding floor-to-ceiling windows to capture the breathtaking views. The property had nearly tripled in value since we bought it, partly due to Tom's architectural improvements and partly due to the booming Tahoe real estate market. What Tom didn't realize, what he had never bothered to understand, was that I had structured the original purchase with particular care. As an attorney specializing in real estate law before I'd stepped back from my career to support him, I'd ensured the property was placed in a specific type of trust. At the time, I'd explained it as a tax advantage strategy, which it was, But it also gave me certain powers as trustee that Tom had never fully comprehended. By month 4 of my counter-operation, I had mapped our entire financial landscape: the me retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, the rental property in Portland, and most importantly, the Lake Tahoe house. Tom had built a moderately complex web designed to obscure our true worth, originally to minimize tax exposure, but now, evidently, to hide assets from his wife. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very structures he'd created to protect our wealth from taxation now provided me with the blueprint to redirect that wealth right under his nose. My counter-operation had been methodical and deliberate. I began with the smallest accounts, the ones he rarely checked, making small transfers that wouldn't trigger any alerts. I established my own financial structures mirroring his, but with crucial differences that made mine virtually untraceable to our marital assets. I created documentation that predated his planning, establishing claims that would supersede his in any court. I set my glass down and walked to the window, watching my reflection overlaid on the rainy Seattle night. In the darkness, I could just make out my features, the set of my jaw, the steady gaze that had served me well in courtrooms and negotiations before I'd put my career on hold for Tom's ambitions. Tom had always told me I looked too serious, that I should smile more. Another red flag I had chosen to ignore for too long. The most satisfying part of my operation had been the Lake Tahoe house. 6 months ago, while Tom was on a business trip to New York, which, according to his credit card statements, had actually been in Cabo San Lucas with Mia, I had executed a carefully planned modification to the trust that held the Lake Tahoe property. As trustee, I had the authority to amend certain provisions, a power Tom had given me years ago when he thought I was just handling tedious paperwork. The trust now stipulated that in the event of separation, divorce filing by either party or evidence of infidelity, documented in exquisite detail in a sealed addendum, the property would revert solely to me. The modification was perfectly legal, meticulously documented, and already filed with the relevant authorities in both Washington and Nevada. I checked my watch, a delicate Cartier that Tom had given me for our 10th anniversary. It was nearly 3 a.m. In Lake Tahoe, it would be the same time. I wondered if Tom and Mia were there now, sleeping peacefully in the master bedroom with its stunning lake view, or if they were still in Seattle, planning their escape. Either way, they had no idea what awaited them. I walked back to the counter and picked up my phone again. No response needed. Not yet. Let him think his message had devastated me. Let him imagine me panicking, perhaps calling friends, consulting, attorneys who would tell me it was too late. The longer he believed he had won, the sweeter the moment of revelation would be. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first hints of dawn were beginning to soften the eastern sky. A new day. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of genuine anticipation. The careful planning, the meticulous execution, the countless nights spent constructing this parallel reality, all of it was about to bear fruit. I finished the scotch and set the glass in the sink. In a few hours, I would call my attorney and set the final phase of my plan in motion. By the time Tom realized what had happened, the locks would be changed on the Lake Tahoe house, the security codes updated, and Mia would find herself being escorted off the property by local law enforcement for trespassing. Tom had taught me many things during our marriage, but the most valuable lesson was one he never intended. Patience is the ultimate power, and I had been very, very patient. As I dressed, I mentally reviewed the timeline we'd established. Tom had texted that Mia would sleep surprisingly well that night. 5 solid hours of dreamless rest, the kind that comes with absolute certainty. When I woke, sunlight was streaming. Through the windows I'd forgotten to close, painting bright stripes across our hardwood floors. Tom had insisted on Brazilian cherry during our renovation 3 years ago, despite the contractor's warnings about its sensitivity to Seattle's damp climate. The first winter, it had warped along the south wall. Tom had been furious, blaming everyone but his own insistence on form over function. That was Tom in essence. Beautiful things that couldn't withstand pressure. I made myself coffee using the elaborate espresso machine that Tom had imported from Italy, another trophy purchase that required constant attention. I'd become quite good at maintaining it, just as I'd become good at maintaining so many things in our marriage. The bitter aroma filled the kitchen as I pulled up my secure email account on my tablet. My attorney, Rebecca Chang, was already online. An early riser like me? I'd hired her 13 months ago, right after discovering the first suspicious credit card charges. Rebecca had made a name for herself representing high-value clients in complex property disputes throughout the Pacific Northwest. She wasn't just good, she was surgical in her precision. "It's time," I wrote. He sent the text exactly as we anticipated. Her response came within minutes. "Executing Phase 1 today, meeting at 10 a.m. "I'll be there," I confirmed. I set the tablet down and looked around our home, 300-400 square feet of luxury that had never quite felt like a home. The modern art Tom had collected adorned the walls, each piece selected not for its beauty, but for its investment potential and name recognition. "Coons are having a moment," he'd explained when bringing home a sculpture that cost more than my parents' entire retirement fund. I never told him I found it cold, impersonal. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The morning sun caught the diamond on my left hand, sending prisms dancing across the white countertop. I twisted the ring thoughtfully, feeling its familiar weight. Tom had upgraded it twice during our marriage, each new stone marking a promotion or significant commission. The current iteration was just over 3 carats. "Flawless, just like you should be," he'd said when presenting it on our 10th anniversary. I slid it off and placed it on the counter. The indentation it left behind would fade quickly enough. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister, Elise. "Did you tell him yet?" Elise was the only family member who knew what was coming. As a real estate attorney herself, though in Denver rather than Seattle, she had been an invaluable sounding board. "Not yet," I replied. "But he made the first move this morning. Email. Divorce declaration." Her response was immediate. "What a coward. Are you okay?" Was I okay? I considered the question carefully as I sipped my coffee. Anger had come in the early months of discovery. White-hot rage at the betrayal, not just of his apparent infidelity, but the calculated deception. Then had come a cold, clarifying fury that sharpened my focus and strengthened my resolve. But now, standing in the sunlight with Tom's dismissive text sitting in my inbox, what I felt was something closer to pity. "I'm better than okay," I typed back. "I'm ready." I set my empty cup in the sink and went to dress for my meeting with Rebecca. My closet was a carefully curated collection of designer pieces selected over the years to project exactly the image Tom thought appropriate for the wife of a successful architect. Today, I selected items he had never seen. Things I had purchased in the past year and kept in the back, tags removed but never worn. A charcoal pencil skirt from a boutique in Capitol Hill. A cream silk blouse. Heels that were slightly higher than Tom preferred. Small rebellions, but they felt significant. Be staying at the Lake Tahoe house this summer, which meant they were likely planning to be there within days, if not already en route. By the time they arrived, the initial legal filings would be complete, the property transfer notifications would be registered, and the trust amendment documentation, all 93 meticulously prepared pages, would be in the hands of both our attorneys and the relevant county recorders. I applied my makeup with careful precision, taking more time than usual. There was no reason to rush today. Everything had been prepared months in advance. The weight of secrecy that had pressed on me for so long had lifted, leaving a strange lightness in its wake. My phone rang just as I was fastening my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry I'd brought into our marriage. It was Rebecca. "Olivia," she said without preamble. "The Nevada Property Recorder's Office confirms that the trust amendment has been properly filed and indexed. Your status as sole beneficial owner is officially on record." I smiled as I secured the second earring. "Right on schedule." "You're sure about this strategy? Once we file the restraining order to prevent occupancy, there's no going back. Tom will know immediately that you've been tracking his movements." "He's moving exactly as we predicted he would," I said, checking my reflection one final time. "Let him try to move his girlfriend in. That's exactly where we want them." "Because of the morality clause in the trust amendment," Rebecca said, understanding immediately. "Exactly. The moment they attempt to establish residency together, the violation triggers the forfeiture provision." There was a pause on the line. "You know, in 12 years of practice, I've never had a client who understood property law better than their architect husband." "Tom always did say my attention to detail was excessive," I replied, picking up my handbag and keys. "He meant it as criticism." As I stepped into the elevator, I felt a momentary wave of something, not quite regret, but acknowledgment. 14 years was a significant investment of time, energy, and youth. There had been moments of real connection, genuine affection. Tom hadn't always been the calculating man he'd become, or perhaps he had, and I simply hadn't wanted to see it. The elevator descended smoothly, each floor marking another step away from the life I'd built with Tom. By the time it reached the lobby, I had mentally cataloged and stored away the memories worth keeping. The rest I would leave behind, like outdated clothes that no longer fit. Daniel, the doorman who had watched me come and go for 5 years, tipped his hat as I crossed the marble lobby. "Beautiful day, Mrs. Westbrook." "It certainly is, Daniel," I replied, feeling the April sun warm on my face as he held the door. "And please, call me Olivia." "Of course, Ms. Olivia," he corrected himself with a smile. The air outside was crisp, with early spring carrying the faint scent of cherry blossoms from the park across the street. I checked my watch as I walked toward the parking garage where my car, purchased 4 months ago under my maiden name, was waiting. I had 30 minutes before my meeting with Rebecca, just enough time to stop at the bank and execute the final step in this phase of my plan. As I walked, I felt strangely unburdened. There was no more hiding, no more pretending, no more careful maintenance of a marriage that existed only on the surface. For the first time in years, I was moving towards something rather than carefully, preserving what I knew was already lost. My phone buzzed with another notification, not Elise this time, but my alert system informing me that Tom had just booked 2 first-class tickets from Seattle to Reno, departing this afternoon. In approximately 6 hours, he and Mia would land in Nevada, rent a car, and drive the scenic route around the lake to what Tom still believed was our vacation home. Instead, they would find themselves facing a property with changed locks, updated security codes, and a restraining order prohibiting their entry, all backed by documentation proving my sole ownership through the trust amendment he had never bothered to understand. And I would be on my way to meet with the property management company I'd hired to handle the vacation rental aspect of the house, a profitable business I planned to launch this summer, turning Tom's architectural showpiece into a revenue-generating asset that would help fund my return to full-time legal practice. Rebecca's office occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in downtown Seattle, offering panoramic views of Elliott Bay. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased ferries gliding across the water, though I doubted many of her clients appreciated the scenery. People didn't come to Rebecca Chang when their lives were going well. Her receptionist, a polished young man with impeccable posture, greeted me by name. "Mrs. Westbrook, Ms. Chang is expecting you. May I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "Water. Would be fine, thank you," I replied, settling into one of the minimalist chairs in the waiting area. The walls were adorned with abstract art in calming blues and grays, nothing like the aggressive statement pieces Tom preferred. The effect was intentionally soothing, a sanctuary for people whose personal lives were in turmoil. I recognized the strategy. I'd employed similar tactics when designing my own law firm's offices years ago, before I'd set aside my career to support Tom's. That had been my first significant compromise. We'd met at an industry event in Chicago. I was representing my law firm. He was already an ascending star in architectural circles. Our backgrounds were similar enough to create common ground, different enough to seem complementary. He'd been charming, attentive, intellectually engaging. When he talked about his ambitions, his eyes lit with a passion that was irresistible. 8 months into our relationship, he'd been offered a partnership that required relocation to Seattle. "Come with me," he'd said. "You can find work anywhere with your credentials. This is my big chance." I'd been 33, successful but not yet established enough to turn down the adventure of a new city, a new life. My firm had offices in Seattle, smaller than Chicago but growing. It seemed possible to have both a relationship and a career. 2 years later, when we married, Tom was thriving. My own career had stalled in the transition. "You don't need to work," he'd reasoned. "We're more than comfortable with my income, and honestly, Olivia, the optics are better for me at this level if my wife isn't working for someone else." It had seemed reasonable at the time. A temporary pause, perhaps consulting on my own terms later. The golden handcuffs had been lined with the promise of freedom later. Travel, philanthropy, perhaps children. Instead, I'd found myself gradually transformed into an accessory, an asset in Tom's carefully curated life, expected to be available when needed, invisible when not. "Olivia." Rebecca's voice pulled me from my thoughts. She stood in the doorway to her office, elegant in a tailored charcoal suit, her straight black hair pulled back in a precise chignon. At 48, she radiated the kind of confidence that came from decades of winning battles most people never knew were being fought. I followed her into the corner office where 2 other people waited around a polished conference table. I recognized James Patterson, Rebecca's real estate specialist, and Nina Ortega, the junior attorney who had been handling much of my documentation. The third person, a distinguished-looking woman in her 60s, was unfamiliar. "Olivia, you know. James and Nina," Rebecca said, gesturing to the familiar faces. "This is Judge Marilyn Cooper, retired from the Nevada Circuit Court. She's been consulting with us on the more nuanced aspects of your case." I shook the judge's hand, noting her firm grip and evaluative gaze. "A pleasure, Mrs. Westbrook. I've reviewed your documentation. Most impressive." "Thank you for your assistance, Judge," I replied, taking a seat at the table. Rebecca remained standing, commanding the room with natural authority. "Before we proceed, Olivia, I want to confirm that you're absolutely certain about moving forward today. Once we file these papers, particularly the restraining order against occupancy of the Lake Tahoe property, there will be immediate repercussions." "Am I certain?" I said. Tom's text was explicit in his intentions. She nodded, satisfied. "Then let's review where we stand." James Patterson, a meticulous man with perpetually tousled silver hair, despite his otherwise impeccable appearance, opened his laptop. "As of 0800 this morning, we've documented the completion of the trust amendment recording in Douglas County, Nevada. The amendment clearly establishes Olivia as the sole beneficial owner of the property under the specified conditions, which include cohabitation at the property by a married owner with someone other than their spouse." Tom conveniently triggered the exact condition we laid out, I noted. "The timing works in our favor," Nina added, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency that had made her Rebecca's rising star. "His text message announcing his intention to move Ms. Chen into the property creates a documented intent to violate the morality clause in the trust amendment." The language was very specific about this scenario. Judge Cooper steepled her fingers. The documentation you've provided regarding the timing of his text relative to the pre-filed amendment is particularly compelling. It establishes clear intent and a pattern of behavior that predates any claim he might make that this was a punitive action on your part. Rebecca tapped her tablet, bringing up a complex timeline on the wall screen. Olivia has provided us with a comprehensive history dating back nearly 2 years. A pattern of escalating deceptive behavior from Mr. Westbrook, each designed to obscure his relationship with Ms. Chen and his intentions regarding the marital property. The timeline displayed on the screen told the story more clearly than words could. A pattern of suspicious trips, unexplained expenses, password changes on joint accounts, and increasingly limited access to financial information. Running alongside, this was a careful documentation of my own counter-preparation, the establishment of separate accounts, the vehicle purchase under my maiden name, the strategic amendments to the trust. The narrative is compelling, Judge Cooper observed. But what makes this case unique, Mrs. Westbrook, is your countermeasures. I've never seen such thorough documentation from the disadvantaged spouse. I smiled slightly at her choice of words. I was never the disadvantaged spouse, Judge. Tom just thought I was. For the next hour, we reviewed the filings prepared by Rebecca's team. The petition for separation with its detailed financial disclosures, the emergency motion to enforce the trust amendment regarding the Lake Tahoe property, and most importantly, the supporting documentation of Tom's pattern of deception and my prior legal claim to the property. The trust amendment is particularly elegant, Nina noted with professional admiration. Since you were listed as the co-trustee with specific powers regarding amendments, your modification falls within your legal authority. Mr. Westbrook's signature on the original trust agreement gives him very little recourse. He never read the amendment, I said. He just signed where the lawyer indicated. Tom always considered legal documents beneath his attention unless they involved 8-figure commissions. Rebecca's smile was razor-thin. His oversight, our advantage. As we concluded the review, Rebecca fixed me with her penetrating gaze. The papers will be filed electronically within the hour. The emergency petition for the restraining order should be granted by end of day, given the evidence of imminent occupancy. By the time Tom and Ms. Chen arrive at the property, the local sheriff will be authorized to enforce the order. I nodded, feeling a curious mix of emotions. Resolution, certainly, but also a distant sadness for what had been lost. Not just the marriage, which had been hollow for years, but the person I had once believed Tom to be. What happens after the filing? I asked. Tom will be served electronically since we have his email on record from his text to you, Rebecca explained. Given the nature of the filings, he'll receive notification before he even reaches the property. His attorney, assuming he's already retained one, will receive electronic notification simultaneously. And then? I pressed. Judge Cooper answered, her voice carrying the weight of having witnessed countless such battles. Then, Mrs. Westbrook, the real war begins. Men like your husband don't surrender easily, especially when blindsided. He will fight. He will threaten. He may even try to negotiate. But with the documentation you've provided, his options will be severely limited. Absorbed this, feeling strangely calm. I'm prepared for that. As I left Rebecca's office, downtown Seattle was alive with the energy of midday. Men and women in expensive suits hurried along the sidewalks, phones pressed to ears, ambitions driving them forward. I had once been one of them, before becoming Mrs. Thomas Westbrook. Tomorrow, I will take the first step toward becoming Olivia Reynolds once again. My name, my identity, my life. The cost had been high, years lost, trust shattered, innocence abandoned. But as I walked through the crisp spring air, I couldn't help but feel that what I had gained, wisdom, strength, and the fierce knowledge of my own capabilities, might ultimately prove worth the price. My next stop was First Western Bank, where I'd established accounts separate from Tom's carefully controlled financial ecosystem. The branch manager, Helen Martinez, greeted me personally. "Everything is prepared as you requested, Ms. Reynolds," she said, using my maiden name with the practiced ease of someone who understood the delicacy of such transitions. "The wire transfers are scheduled for execution at 3:00 p.m., and the certified checks are ready." "Thank you, Helen," I replied, appreciating her professionalism. The financial preparation had been perhaps the most critical component of my counter-strategy. While Tom had been maneuvering to protect his assets in anticipation of a divorce, I wasn't supposed to see coming. I had been methodically establishing financial independence, setting up separate accounts, securing my own credit, ensuring access to liquid funds that wouldn't be subject to freezing during divorce proceedings. As I signed the final authorization forms, I felt the last pieces of my preparation falling into place. By evening, the Lake Tahoe property would be legally secured, my financial position would be stabilized, and Tom would be facing the consequences of his assumption that I would remain the passive, accommodating wife he had crafted through years of subtle diminishment. The irony wasn't lost on me that if he had simply approached me honestly, if he had said he wanted to end our marriage, to move on with Mia, I might have negotiated fairly. The Lake Tahoe house might even have been part of a reasonable settlement, but his decision to deceive, to manipulate, to assume I was too naive to protect myself, that had triggered not just self-preservation, but a determination to demonstrate that his assessment of me had been profoundly mistaken. As I left the bank, my phone buzzed with a notification. Tom's flight had just taken off from SeaTac right on schedule. In a few hours, he would land in Reno, make the drive to Lake Tahoe with Mia, and discover that the vacation home where he planned to start his new life was no longer his to claim. The next phase of my plan was about to begin. After leaving the bank, I found myself walking toward Pike Place Market instead of returning directly home. I needed space to think, to breathe before the machinery we'd set in motion began its inexorable process. The market was alive with afternoon activity. Tourists photographing fish being tossed at the famous seafood counter, locals navigating, the crowds with practiced ease to reach their favorite vendors. I found an empty bench overlooking Elliott Bay and sat watching a ferry glide across the water's surface, serene above, furiously paddling below. An apt metaphor for my marriage, particularly these last 2 years. The first warning sign had been so small I nearly missed it. A dinner reservation confirmation that arrived in our shared email account. Not unusual in itself, except this was, for Canlis, Tom's favorite restaurant, on a night when he was supposedly in Portland. I hadn't mentioned it. Instead, I checked his calendar and noted the discrepancy. A tiny data point that meant nothing in isolation. 2 weeks later, there was another, a credit card charge for a hotel in Vancouver on a Wednesday night when Tom had claimed to be working late, coming home after midnight with the distant, distracted air I had come to recognize as his important client demeanor. Again, I said nothing, just noted the inconsistency and continued watching. It wasn't that I suspected an affair, not at first. Tom's devotion had always been to his career, his status, his achievements. Women had always been attracted to him, his confidence, his seemingly effortless success, but his vanity had generally been satisfied with their attention rather than their company. The third sign had been the most telling. I had been looking for a tax document in his home office, with his knowledge and permission, when I found a brochure for private banking services in the Caymans. The brochure itself wasn't unusual. Tom received such materials constantly. But what caught my attention was the handwritten note on the back listing account numbers and contact information. I had photographed it with my phone and replaced it, exactly as I'd found it. That evening, I used Tom's laptop while he was showering, a routine he never varied, 15 minutes precisely, and found emails confirming the establishment of a new account. The initial transfer had been $175,000, described as a personal investment fund. We had no joint investment strategy that included Cayman banking, no discussions about diversifying our holdings internationally beyond what his financial advisors already managed. This was something separate, something deliberately kept from me. That night I had lain awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing, and made a decision. Instead of confrontation, I would choose investigation. Instead of accusation, I would pursue knowledge. My training as an attorney had taught me that evidence, when properly gathered, revealed truths that words often obscured. The next morning, I called Elise. "I need your perspective," I had told her over coffee in a cafe far from our usual haunts. As a sister and as an attorney. Elise had listened without interruption as I outlined what I had discovered. The discrepancies, the hidden account, the pattern of small deceptions. It could be nothing, she had offered, though her expression suggested she believed otherwise. Midlife crisis, maybe? Secret surprise for your anniversary? I smiled at her attempt to offer an innocent explanation. Our anniversary was 4 months ago, and Tom doesn't do surprises unless they benefit his image. She nodded, the attorney in her taking over. So, what do you want to do? I want to know what I'm dealing with before I decide how to respond. That conversation had been the catalyst. Within a week, I had established a secure email account, opened a safe deposit box at a bank Tom didn't use, and begun systematically documenting our financial landscape, both what I knew and what I suspected. My phone vibrated, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a text from Rebecca. "All filings complete. Emergency restraining order granted regarding Lake Tahoe property. Sheriff notified. Tom's flight landed 10 minutes ago." I texted back a simple thank you and checked my watch. Tom and Mia would be at the rental car counter now, perhaps already on the road to Lake Tahoe. They would arrive to find a sheriff's deputy waiting with the restraining order, barring them from entering the property. I stood, smoothing down my skirt and taking one last look at the peaceful scene before me. In less than 2 hours, Tom would discover that his carefully constructed exit strategy had crashed against the rocky shore of reality. The thought didn't bring me joy, but it did bring a sense of rightness, of balance restored to a world that had tilted too far in the direction of deception. I returned to our Seattle home, knowing it might be the last peaceful evening I would spend there for some time. Once Tom realized what had happened, the conflict would escalate dramatically. I had barely walked through the door when my phone rang. Rebecca again. "The sheriff served the order," she said without preamble. "Tom and Ms. Chen arrived at the property about 20 minutes ago. The security company had already changed the locks and codes as directed by the court." "How did he react?" I asked, slipping off my shoes. According to the deputy, initially with disbelief, then anger. He demanded to see the paperwork, claimed, "There must be a mistake. When he saw your name on the trust amendment, he became vocal." I could imagine the scene. Tom's face flushing with that particular shade of red that appeared only when his carefully maintained control slipped. "And Mia?" The deputy didn't provide details, but apparently she opted to wait in the car during most of the exchange. Smart woman, I thought. She was learning quickly what she'd gotten herself into. "What's next?" I asked. Tom called his attorney from the property, Garrett Wilson, high-end divorce attorney from San Francisco. They're likely strategizing now. Expect contact within the hour. I thanked her and ended the call, then poured myself a glass of Pinot Noir from a bottle Tom would have considered beneath his sophisticated palate. I carried it to the living room and settled into my favorite chair, the one with the view of the Sound, and waited. The call came at 7:43 p.m., Tom's name illuminating my phone screen. I let it ring 3 times, collecting myself, then answered, with a simple, "Hello, Tom." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to confirm that something had gone dramatically wrong in his carefully constructed world. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tension I had rarely heard. Controlled. Fury underlaid with genuine shock. What the hell have you done? Each word was precisely enunciated, as if maintaining verbal composure might somehow restore order to his unraveling plans. I'm not sure what you mean, I replied, my voice steady. I just received a rather interesting text message myself early this morning. Perhaps we're having similar days. Another pause, this one briefer. I could almost see him recalibrating, shifting from indignation to calculation. This is unnecessary, Olivia. Whatever you think you're doing, we can resolve this privately like rational adults. That's an interesting perspective, I said, considering your 2:17 a.m. text informing me that you'd moved your girlfriend into our vacation home. Was that your idea of a private, rational resolution? That was... He stopped himself. Tom rarely made verbal mistakes, and he certainly didn't admit to them. You're misinterpreting the situation. Mia is a colleague who needed a place to stay while working on the lakeside project. I almost laughed at the audacity. A colleague who needed to stay in our vacation home, with you, while you need space from your wife. That's quite a generous employment benefit, Tom. Does your firm offer it to all junior designers, or just the ones you're sleeping with? The sharp intake of breath on the other end confirmed that my intelligence had surprised him. He hadn't expected this level of specific knowledge. You've been spying on me? Accusation had replaced shock, a calculated attempt to shift the moral high ground. No, I corrected. I've been documenting your systematic attempt to establish a separate life while still married, a significant legal distinction. The trust amendment was filed 6 months ago, Tom. The morality clause was quite specific about cohabitation with someone other than your spouse. The distinction, he said, his voice hardening, is that I've spent 15 years building our life while you've played at being an architect's wife. Whatever you think you're entitled to. Washington is a community property state, I interrupted, and I have 14 years of evidence documenting my contributions to our marriage, including the strategic sacrifice of my own career to support yours. But we both know this isn't really about legal entitlements, is it, Tom? He was silent, waiting for me to continue, probably recording the conversation for his attorney. I didn't mind. Everything I said was precisely calibrated. This is about you believing you could discard me like an outdated design, that you could extract maximum value while minimizing your costs, the same approach you've applied to every relationship in your life. That's a creative interpretation, he said, his voice cooler now, more controlled. But you've made a serious tactical error. The trust amendment won't hold up in court. Garrett is already preparing an emergency motion to vacate the restraining order. Garrett Wilson is an excellent attorney, I finished for him. But even he will have difficulty challenging a properly executed trust amendment filed and recorded 6 months ago, with your signature on the original document giving me amendment powers. The documentation establishes a pattern of planning that predates any claim you might make about my actions being retaliatory. The silence that followed was different, heavier, charged with the dawning realization that he wasn't simply facing an inconvenient legal challenge, but a comprehensive dismantling of his entire strategy. How did you... He began, then stopped. Himself. Another recalibration. These are temporary setbacks, he said finally. Legal maneuvers that will only cost us both time and money. The amendments are documented, witnessed, and already filed with the relevant authorities, I said. Your attorney has probably already advised you that challenging them will only extend the discovery process, which would give the court access to accounts you believe are still safely hidden. I heard muffled voices in the background. He wasn't alone, probably already conferring with his attorney. Olivia. His voice had shifted again, adopting the reasonable, slightly patronizing tone he used when negotiating. I think we both need to take a step back. Divorce is emotional, but it doesn't have to be destructive. I'm prepared to offer a very generous settlement, one that acknowledges your contributions while avoiding a protracted legal battle that would only benefit our attorneys. That's thoughtful, I replied, matching his reasonable tone. And what would this generous settlement include? He outlined figures quickly. A lump sum payment, monthly support for 2 years, and the Seattle house. The numbers were substantial. By ordinary standards, but represented less than 30% of our actual marital assets. I see, I said when he finished. And in exchange, I would withdraw the trust amendment, release the Lake Tahoe property, and surrender any claims to the Cayman accounts. Exactly, he said, relief coloring his voice. A clean break that lets us both move forward. I let a moment pass, as if considering his offer. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Tom. You see, I'm not negotiating for a percentage of our assets. I'm simply ensuring that the division is truly equitable, as required by law. Don't be naive, he snapped, the reasonable facade cracking. This isn't about law, it's about leverage. And right now you think you have it, but trust me, Olivia, you don't want this fight. No, Tom, I corrected gently. You had leverage you thought I couldn't counter. Past tense. The difference matters. I ended the call before he could respond, setting the phone down with hands that were surprisingly steady. The first confrontation had gone exactly as expected. Initial shock, followed by accusation, then attempted negotiation, and finally, thinly veiled threats. Tom would recover quickly. He would develop new strategies, deploy additional resources, and prepare for extended conflict. But for the first time in our relationship, he would do so with the unsettling knowledge that he was facing an opponent who had anticipated his every move and prepared accordingly. The balance of power had shifted, and we both knew it. After the first confrontation, events accelerated with the mechanistic inevitability of dominoes falling. Tom, true to his nature, refused to accept the initial setback as definitive. Within hours of our call, the escalation began, a multi-pronged counterattack designed to regain control of both the narrative and the property. The first salvo arrived via email at 5:17 p.m., a formal communication from Garrett Wilson, senior partner at Wilson, Drake, and Associates, San Francisco's most exclusive, an expensive divorce firm. The message was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, outlining potential claims against me ranging from breach of fiduciary duty to fraudulent misrepresentation. Each paragraph carried the unmistakable subtext: this will be expensive, exhausting, and ultimately futile. I forwarded it to Rebecca without comment. She responded within minutes. Standard playbook. Ignore. At 6:02 p.m., the personal approach began, a series of text messages from Tom, each carefully calibrated to strike a specific emotional note. Olivia, this hostility isn't like you. Let's talk in person. We had 14 good years. Does it really need to end in legal warfare? I'm concerned about your state of mind. This vindictive behavior isn't healthy. My offer still stands, but it has a time limit. After midnight, everything changes. The progression was textbook Tom: reasonableness, nostalgia, concern trolling, and finally, thinly veiled threats. I didn't respond to any of them, which I knew would unsettle him more than any reply. Tom had always found silence intolerable. It was the one response he couldn't immediately analyze and counter. At 7:43 p.m., the social pressure began. My phone lit up with a call from Vanessa Hildebrand, the self-appointed social arbiter of our circle, whose husband happened to be on the board of Tom's architectural firm. Vanessa and I had maintained a cordial but distant relationship over the years. I attended her charity galas. She pretended my background was as privileged as hers. Olivia, darling, she gushed when I answered, as if we were intimate friends. I've just heard the most disturbing news. Tell me it's not true that you and Tom are having difficulties. Vanessa, I replied evenly. How thoughtful of you to call. Yes, Tom and I are separating. Her sharp intake of breath was almost comical. But surely this can be resolved privately. Tom has been telling everyone there's been a terrible misunderstanding, that you've had some sort of episode. Has he? I interjected, my voice cooling. How interesting, considering he sent me a text explicitly stating he was moving his girlfriend into our vacation home. That seems rather clear as misunderstandings go. The silence that followed told me everything. Vanessa hadn't called to offer support. She'd called to gather intelligence for Tom, to assess how firm my position was, and perhaps to convey veiled warnings about social consequences. I had no idea, she finally managed. That certainly changes things. Yes, I agreed. It certainly does. If you'll excuse me, Vanessa, I have calls to return. By 9:00 p.m., Tom had escalated to the financial realm. My phone pinged with security alerts, attempts to access joint accounts that had already been frozen or restructured. He was testing the boundaries, looking for vulnerabilities, any financial avenue that remained open to him. At 9:34 p.m., a more serious breach was attempted. My secure email account registered multiple password reset attempts, followed by a sophisticated phishing attack designed to capture my authentication credentials. The attempts originated from an IP address in San Francisco, almost certainly the offices of whatever security consultant Tom had engaged for digital countermeasures. I notified Cyber Shield Security immediately. I had anticipated exactly this type of escalation and had retained their services 2 months earlier, the same firm that protected several major law firms from corporate espionage. Their confirmation came quickly. Attempts blocked, countermeasures deployed, digital perimeter secure. At 10:17 p.m., the most predictable escalation arrived. A call from Tom's oldest friend and fraternity brother, Michael Bennett, now a senior partner at a prestigious Seattle law firm. Michael had been my assigned dinner companion at countless social events over the years, his practice charm never quite concealing his fundamental belief that wives were decorative accessories rather than full partners. Olivia, he began without preamble when I answered. This has gone far enough. You need to call off your attack dogs. Good evening, Michael, I replied. I assume Tom asked you to intercede? I'm calling as someone who cares about both of you, he said, voice dripping with insincere concern. This scorched earth approach helps no one. Tom is prepared to be reasonable, but you're forcing him into a corner. You may not like his response. Is that a threat, Michael? It's a reality check, he countered. You're playing a game with rules you don't fully understand. Tom has connections that what? I interrupted. Could it destroy me financially? Damage my reputation? Ensure I never work in this town again? Please, Michael, at least be original in your intimidation tactics. His voice hardened. You've made a serious miscalculation. Tom won't just roll over because you've managed a few clever legal maneuvers. He's already speaking with regulators about potential improprieties in your financial activities. You mean he's attempting to report me for the very actions he himself took? I asked mildly. That would require him to acknowledge those Cayman transfers were intended to hide marital assets, an admission that would trigger additional regulatory scrutiny he can't afford. Michael paused, clearly not expecting this level of strategic thinking. This isn't just about money anymore, he said finally. Tom feels betrayed. How fascinating, I said, that Tom feels betrayed by my response to his betrayal. The psychological gymnastics are truly impressive. After ending the call with Michael, I poured myself another glass of wine and moved to the terrace. The night had turned cool, the city lights blinking below like earthbound stars. The escalation was proceeding exactly as I had anticipated in my strategic planning sessions with Rebecca and her team. Each of Tom's countermoves had been predicted, each response prepared in advance. He was operating according to his standard playbook: legal intimidation, emotional manipulation, social pressure, financial aggression, and finally, deployment of powerful connections. It was the approach that had served him throughout his career, the systematic application of leverage against increasingly reluctant opposition until capitulation was the only rational choice. What Tom had yet to understand was that the traditional Power dynamics that had defined our marriage no longer applied. I had spent a year dismantling his financial advantage, documenting his legal vulnerabilities, and insulating myself from precisely the social and professional pressures he was now attempting to apply. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Second wave of emergency motions denied. Tom's attempt to vacate the restraining order failed. Judge upheld the trust amendment pending full discovery. Do you want an update call tonight or morning? Morning is fine, I replied. Everything is proceeding as expected. I finished my wine, watching the city below continue its endless rhythm, oblivious to the high-stakes battle being waged in condos and offices above. Tomorrow would bring new escalations, new tactics, perhaps even more desperate measures as Tom confronted the reality that his extraction plan had not merely failed, but backfired catastrophically. For the first time in our 14-year marriage, Tom was not fighting from a position of overwhelming advantage. He was fighting from a position of increasing vulnerability against an opponent who had studied his methods, anticipated his moves, and neutralized his traditional sources of power. The escalation would continue, but its trajectory had already been irrevocably altered. Morning arrived with a clarity that matched my state of mind. I had slept deeply, waking refreshed despite the previous day's confrontations and escalations. As I prepared for my 9 a.m. call with Rebecca, my phone buzzed with a notification, a new email from Tom's personal account rather than through his attorney. The timestamp showed 4:38 a.m. Either he hadn't slept, or he had woken in the darkest part of night with a new approach. I opened it cautiously, half expecting another threat or manipulation attempt. Instead, I found something more interesting, the first signs of a strategic pivot. Olivia, he wrote. After reflection, I recognize that we've begun this process in a regrettable manner. My initial approach was inappropriate and reactive. I propose a reset, a mediated conversation with neutral third parties where we can discuss equitable division without further escalation. This benefits neither of us, and certainly not our shared legacy. I forwarded it to Rebecca with a single comment. Phase 2 begins. Tom's pivot was predictable but still fascinating to observe. Having failed with intimidation, emotional manipulation, and social pressure, he was now attempting the reasonable conciliator role, positioning himself as the mature party seeking resolution while implicitly casting me as the aggressor. This was the Tom I knew best, adaptive, pragmatic, willing to abandon failed strategies without sentimental attachment. He had recognized that his initial approach had backfired and was now recalibrating, seeking a narrative that would preserve as much of his position as possible while appearing to take the high road. Rebecca's call came precisely at 9 a.m. Good. Morning, she said briskly. I see Tom has discovered the virtue of reasonableness overnight. Exactly as anticipated, I replied, settling into the chair by the window. What's our current position? Stronger than yesterday, she said. Judge Abernathy rejected all of Wilson's emergency motions. Tom's team now has 72 hours to provide complete documentation on all financial holdings, domestic and international. The Lake Tahoe property remains under the protective order, and, interesting development here, Mia appears to have returned to Seattle last night. The hotel reservation was made 3 hours after Tom was served with our filings. I smiled slightly. Mia's retreat was unsurprising but still satisfying. She had signed on for the successful architect with a clean exit from his marriage, not a man embroiled in complex legal proceedings with frozen assets and a thwarted plan. How should we respond to his mediation proposal? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We acknowledge it positively while maintaining our current legal position, Rebecca said, open to dialogue while giving away nothing substantive. The standard language is in your secure folder. After the call, I reviewed the draft response Rebecca had prepared weeks ago in anticipation of exactly this pivot. The language was calibrated. Perfectly. Professional, non-antagonistic, but maintaining firm boundaries around the discovery process and asset preservation requirements. I sent it with minor modifications, then turned my attention to my own strategic pivot. While Tom had been deploying his cascading pressure tactics yesterday, I had been quietly executing the next phase of my own strategy. With the initial legal protections in place and Tom's attention focused on regaining control of the Lake Tahoe property, I had begun the process of professional reestablishment. At 11 a.m., I had a virtual meeting with the managing partner of Hamilton Legal Group, a boutique firm specializing in complex property disputes. I had interviewed with them 2 months earlier, laying the groundwork for this moment. Today's meeting would formalize my return to legal practice, not as Mrs. Thomas Westbrook, but as Olivia Reynolds, J.D., with 14 years of life experience that had only sharpened my understanding of how property disputes affected real people. My phone buzzed again, a text from the Lake Tahoe Security Company confirming that the locks had been changed, security codes updated, and new monitoring systems installed. The property was secure, just as my future was becoming. The following morning, I awoke to a text from Elise. Flight landing at 10:15. See you soon. My sister had been my first and most steadfast ally throughout this process, and now she was flying in from Denver to provide in-person support during the crucial next phase. As I prepared for the day, I reflected on the network that had sustained me through the past year, the carefully assembled support system that had made my counter-strategy possible. While Tom had always relied on transactional relationships built on mutual benefit and strategic advantage, I had cultivated connections founded on trust, respect, and shared values. Elise arrived at our Seattle home shortly before noon, wrapping me in a hug that carried the familiar scent of her signature Jo Malone perfume. At 47, 2 years my senior, she carried herself with the confident poise of a woman who had built her own successful law practice while raising a daughter as a single mother after her own divorce 8 years earlier. You look good, she said, studying my face with sisterly scrutiny. Tired but strong. I feel strong, I admitted, helping her with her bag. Stronger than I expected. Over lunch on the terrace overlooking the Sound, I updated her on the developments of the past 48 hours. Tom's escalation tactics, his subsequent pivot to reasonableness, the ongoing legal maneuvers, and my own strategic positioning. He underestimated you catastrophically, Elise noted, a satisfied gleam in her eye. Men like Tom can't conceive of women as strategic equals. It's their perpetual blind spot. It wasn't just Tom, I said, setting down my fork. It was the entire system he operates within. None of them saw me clearly. Elise nodded thoughtfully. Which is precisely why your support system was so crucial. You needed people who did see you. Your capabilities, your resilience, your strategic mind. She was right. From the beginning, I had recognized that navigating this situation would require more than just legal representation or financial expertise. It would demand a comprehensive support network that could provide specialized knowledge, emotional stability, and strategic perspective. Beyond Elise and Rebecca, my inner circle included Dr. Samantha Reed, a psychologist specializing in high conflict divorces, who had helped me maintain my equilibrium throughout the process. Our weekly sessions had provided a safe space to process the anger, grief, and anxiety that accompanied the dissolution of a 14-year marriage, even one that had grown as hollow as mine and Tom's. How are you really doing with all this? Elise asked, her expression softening. The strategic part is clearly going according to plan, but emotionally? I considered the question carefully. I'm not heartbroken in the traditional sense. What hurts most isn't losing Tom. That relationship had been fading for years. It's the realization that he never truly saw me, even after 14 years. That's the betrayal that cuts deepest. Elise reached across the table to squeeze my hand. His failure to see you doesn't diminish your worth. If anything, it highlights his limitations. After lunch, we were joined by Lauren Davidson, my financial advisor, who had helped construct the parallel banking and investment infrastructure that now formed the foundation of my independent financial identity. Unlike the advisors in Tom's orbit who prioritized aggressive growth and tax avoidance above all else, Lauren had helped me build a balanced portfolio that reflected my own values and priorities. The markets responded to yesterday's news, Lauren reported, pulling up data on her tablet. Westbrook Architectural Partners stock down 2%. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to signal investor concern. This was relevant not just for market intelligence, but because part of my settlement strategy involved WOP stock options that Tom had accumulated over the years. Their fluctuating value would influence both his negotiating position and the ultimate financial terms of our divorce. "What's your read on their likely response?" I asked. "The firm will prioritize stability and client confidence," Lauren assessed. "If the conflict between you two becomes public enough to affect projects or client relationships, they'll distance themselves further from Tom. Their fiduciary obligations to investors will outweigh any personal loyalty." The afternoon brought another crucial member of my support system, Julian Mercer, the cybersecurity specialist whose team had protected my digital infrastructure from Tom's attempted incursions. Unlike the stereotype of the socially awkward tech genius, Julian was a former FBI cybercrime investigator with both technical expertise and strategic understanding. "We've registered continued attempts to access your accounts," he reported, his manner professional but warm. "Nothing concerning. Standard penetration testing approaches, likely from the same security firm as yesterday. Our countermeasures remain effective." "Any attempts against the documentation archives?" Elise asked. Julian shook his head. "The distributed storage system has proven secure. Even if they managed to compromise one location, the blockchain verification would preserve the integrity of the records." This sophisticated digital security had been Elise's recommendation early in the process. She had seen too many divorces where critical documentation mysteriously disappeared or was altered, leaving the less technologically savvy spouse at a severe disadvantage. By evening, the final piece of my support system arrived. Rachel Kwan, my friend of 18 years who had flown in from Chicago. Unlike the professionals who provided specialized expertise, Rachel offered something equally valuable: the grounding presence of someone who had known me before I became Mrs. Thomas Westbrook, someone who remembered Olivia Reynolds, the ambitious attorney with big dreams and uncompromising principles. Over dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Queen Anne, far from the upscale establishments Tom and I had frequented during our marriage, Rachel asked the question others had carefully avoided. "After all this is resolved, what do you actually want for yourself, Liv? Not just financially or professionally, but personally." The question caught me off guard. For so long, my focus had been on strategy, on countering Tom's moves, on securing my rightful share of our marital assets. I had given less thought to what would come after the legal battles were concluded. I began, then paused to find the words. I want to rebuild a life that's authentically mine, not defined by Tom or by this divorce, but by my own choices and values. I want work that matters, relationships that nurture, and the freedom to evolve without constraint. Rachel smiled, a look of recognition in her eyes. There she is, the Olivia I've always known. As the evening concluded and my support team dispersed, Elise to the guest room, the others to their respective homes or hotels, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. While Tom operated in a world of power plays and leverage, I had built something more enduring, a community of competent, ethical individuals who had contributed not just their expertise, but their genuine support to my journey. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. Tom's latest message indicated he was preparing another strategic shift, likely more aggressive after the professional setback of his failed attempt to vacate the restraining order. But whatever came next, I would face it not as an isolated individual, but as someone anchored in a network of support that Tom, for all his resources and connections, could not match. In this, Perhaps more than any other aspect of our divorce, the fundamental difference between us was most clearly revealed. The next morning, Rebecca called with an update that shifted the landscape once again. Tom's attorney has requested a formal mediation session, she said. Not just a preliminary meeting, but a structured negotiation with a retired judge as mediator. They're pushing for Judge Raymond Chen. That's a significant concession, I noted. Judge Chen was known for his strict adherence to equitable distribution principles and his intolerance for hidden assets. It suggests Tom's receiving more realistic legal advice, Rebecca agreed. Wilson must have reviewed our documentation and advised him that fighting this through the courts would likely yield worse results than negotiation. Or they're playing for time, Elise suggested, having overheard the conversation. Delay tactics are standard when you're trying to reposition assets. That possibility is precisely why we'll agree to mediation while maintaining all the protective orders and freezes, Rebecca said. They can negotiate, but they can't touch anything until agreements are signed. I considered the implications. Tom's shift to a formal mediation request represented a significant recalibration of his strategy, moving from confrontation to negotiation, from denial to acknowledgment. It suggested that reality was beginning to penetrate his initial shock and anger. How soon can this happen? I asked. Chen has an opening next Tuesday. I've tentatively accepted, pending your approval. Let's do it, I confirmed. After ending the call, I turned to Elise. What do you think he'll offer? She considered the question with the practiced assessment of someone who had negotiated hundreds of divorce settlements. Initially, something. That looks generous on paper but preserves his core assets, probably 40% of the visible marital estate while trying to keep the Cayman accounts and similar vehicles off the table. He'll position it as magnanimous, while knowing it's significantly less than you're entitled to. And his real goal? Containment and damage limitation, she said without hesitation. He's realized he can't win outright, so he's shifting to minimizing losses. The Lake Tahoe property will be the symbolic battleground, the thing he fights hardest to keep because it represents his perfect future with Mia. I nodded, seeing the strategy clearly, which makes it the perfect leverage point. Exactly, Elise smiled. You don't actually want the house. You want what it represents in the overall settlement. She was right. The vacation home had been Tom's pride, his showcase, his planned future. But for me, it had always been more valuable as a negotiating tool than as a property I wanted to maintain. Its emotional significance to Tom far outweighed its financial value in the broader context of our marital assets. So we hold firm on the trust amendment through the initial rounds, I said, thinking aloud, then offered to consider releasing it in exchange for full disclosure and division of the offshore accounts. Plus a premium, Elise added. He needs to understand there's a cost to having attempted the deception in the first place. This strategic planning session continued into the evening, with Rachel and Lauren joining us to review financial models and settlement scenarios. By midnight, we had developed a comprehensive negotiation strategy with clear boundaries, fallback positions, and defined outcomes. As my support network gathered around my dining table, lawyer, financial advisor, cybersecurity expert, and lifelong friend, I felt a surge of certainty that had nothing to do with anger or revenge. This wasn't about punishing Tom. It was about reclaiming my rightful place as an equal partner, deserving equal treatment. The contrast between Tom's transactional approach to relationships and my investment in genuine connections had never been clearer or more consequential to the outcome that was steadily taking shape. 3 days later, the moment arrived for the first face-to-face meeting between Tom and me since his fateful text. The neutral ground selected for this encounter was the conference room at Chen Mediation Services, a highly respected firm that specialized in high-value divorce negotiations. Elise accompanied me as additional support, though Rebecca would handle all legal aspects. We arrived 15 minutes early, giving us time to settle into the space and establish a psychological advantage. The conference room was designed for precisely this type of high-stakes negotiation, tastefully decorated in muted blues and grays, with comfortable but professional seating arranged around a polished maple table. Large windows offered views of downtown Seattle, a calming backdrop to what promised to be a tense encounter. "Remember," Rebecca advised as we reviewed our materials, "Tom will attempt to establish dominance immediately. He'll likely use familiarity, perhaps even nostalgia, to create the impression that this is still a conversation between husband and wife rather than opposing parties in litigation." I nodded, appreciating yet again Rebecca's psychological insight. "And when that fails, he'll pivot to intimidation or condescension," Elise added. "Exactly," Rebecca confirmed. "Your advantage is that you anticipate his tactics, while he continues to underestimate yours." At precisely 10 a.m., the door opened. Tom entered first, followed by Garrett Wilson and a younger attorney carrying multiple folders. My first impression was of subtle but definite change in Tom's appearance. The perfectly tailored suit remained, as did the expensive watch and carefully maintained haircut, but there was a tightness around his eyes, a slight stiffness in his movements that betrayed the stress of the past several days. His gaze found mine immediately, assessing, calculating. I met it directly, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply present and centered in my own authority. For a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his features. He had expected either anger or anxiety, not this calm self-possession. "Olivia," he said, his voice projecting warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "Tom," I replied with a neutral nod, offering nothing more. The mediator, Judge Raymond Chen, a distinguished man in his 60s with a reputation for unflappable professionalism, called the meeting to order. "Before we begin, I want to establish ground rules," he said. "This is a facilitated negotiation, not a court proceeding. Our goal is productive dialogue that might lead toward resolution of contested issues. I'll ask that everyone maintain professional courtesy regardless of personal feelings." The initial hour proceeded with formal presentations of positions. Garrett Wilson outlined Tom's proposal, a settlement that appeared generous on first glance, but represented less than 35% of our actual marital assets. Rebecca countered with our comprehensive asset inventory, including documentation of the Cayman accounts, property transfers, and investment vehicles that Tom had attempted to conceal. Throughout this exchange, Tom maintained a facade of attentive professionalism, though I noted the subtle tells that signaled his growing frustration, the slight tapping of his finger against his thigh, the occasional tightening of his jaw. He had expected this meeting to be an opportunity to establish control over the negotiation process. Instead, it was becoming increasingly apparent that his position was fundamentally compromised. After the formal presentations, Judge Chen suggested a brief recess. As the others stepped out, Tom made his move, approaching me directly. "This isn't necessary," he said quietly, voice pitched for my ears alone. "We built something valuable together, Olivia. Do you really want to see it destroyed by attorneys? Who profit from conflict?" I regarded him steadily. "What we built was dismantled the moment you began hiding assets and planning your exit strategy, Tom. This isn't about emotion or retribution. It's simply about equitable division of what we created together." His expression hardened slightly. "You've made your point. I underestimated you. But this path you're taking, freezing accounts, involving regulators, damaging my professional standing, it hurts you as much as it hurts me. The longer this drags on, the more our combined assets will diminish." "That's a perspective," I acknowledged. "Another is that accountability isn't something to be avoided but embraced. If our assets diminish because you attempted to hide them through legally questionable means, that's not a failure of my strategy, but a consequence of yours." Tom leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "What do you actually want, Olivia? Beyond the money, beyond making your point. Because whatever it is, we can negotiate directly. Cut out the attorneys, the mediators, all of this theater. I recognized the tactic immediately, an attempt to reestablish our former dynamic where Tom made the real decisions while creating the illusion of joint consideration. It might have worked months ago when I was still accustomed to deferring to his financial expertise. What I want, I replied evenly, is already documented in our filings: equitable division of assets, transparent accounting of all holdings, and acknowledgment of my contributions to our marital estate. Nothing more, nothing less. Frustration flickered across his face. This isn't you. The Olivia I know isn't vindictive. Someone's gotten to you, your sister, that shark of an attorney. They're pushing you toward conflict that serves their interests, not yours. I nearly smiled at the predictable attempt to drive wedges between me and my support system. The Olivia you knew was carefully curated to meet your expectations, Tom. Perhaps what's unsettling isn't that I've changed, but that you're finally seeing aspects of me that were always there, just invisible to you before. Before he could respond, the others returned to the room. The remainder of the meeting focused on procedural matters: scheduling for discovery compliance, parameters for asset valuation, and protocols for ongoing financial disclosures. Throughout these discussions, I noticed Tom becoming increasingly withdrawn, his participation more perfunctory. It wasn't until the meeting's conclusion that I understood why. As we gathered our materials, his younger attorney approached Rebecca with a document. "This was just filed," he said, his tone professional but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. "Mr. Westbrook is petitioning for nullification of the trust amendment on grounds of undue influence and failure to disclose. The hearing is scheduled for Friday morning." Rebecca accepted the document without reaction. "We'll be there." Outside the mediation center, Elise placed a hand on my arm. "He's desperate. The restraining order must be creating more pressure than we anticipated." "It's not just the restraining order," I said, watching Tom's car pull away from the curb. "It's the loss of control. This meeting was supposed to reestablish his dominance, to create a negotiating environment he could manipulate. Instead, it confirmed that the power dynamics have fundamentally shifted." "What do you think he'll try next?" she asked. I considered the question, recalling the slight shift in Tom's demeanor toward the meeting's end, the withdrawal that signaled not defeat, but recalculation. "Something unexpected," I said. "He realized that conventional tactics aren't working. He'll look for a vulnerability we haven't protected against, a pressure point we haven't anticipated." Rebecca joined us, her expression thoughtful. "I've reviewed the petition. It's clever, arguing that you concealed your legal expertise and took advantage of Tom's trust to amend the document without his understanding of the implications. He's claiming he never read the amendments because he trusted you implicitly as his wife." "Will it work?" Elise asked. "Unlikely," Rebecca replied, "but that may not be its primary purpose. This could be a distraction while he maneuvers elsewhere." As we drove back to the Seattle house, I felt a curious mixture of satisfaction and wariness. The confrontation had gone largely as anticipated. Tom had attempted familiarity, then negotiation, then manipulation, all without success. But his final withdrawal suggested a strategic pivot was coming, one we might not have fully anticipated. The climactic confrontation wasn't over. It had merely shifted to a new battlefield. One Tom was still selecting. But whatever came next, the fundamental truth remained unchanged. He was now reacting to my strategy rather than implementing his own, and in that crucial reversal lay my continued advantage. Tom's petition for nullification was scheduled to be heard by Judge Isabella Ramirez, a jurist known for her meticulous attention to detail and strict adherence to procedural requirements. Rebecca and I spent the next 2 days preparing our response, gathering additional documentation to counter Tom's claims of undue influence. The most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source: Tom's own emails to his financial advisor, dated months before my trust amendment, discussing the potential for hiding assets through trust structures he believed I wouldn't understand. These communications had been part of our discovery request, initially resisted by Tom's legal team, but ultimately produced under court order. These effectively demolish his claim that he implicitly trusted you to handle legal matters, Rebecca noted as we reviewed the evidence. They establish a pattern of attempted concealment that predates your amendments. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and bright, a beautiful Seattle spring day that contrasted sharply with the contentious legal battle about to unfold. I dressed carefully in a conservative navy suit, not one of the designer outfits Tom had selected, but a piece I'd purchased myself from a local boutique that specialized in women's professional wear. As Elise and I prepared to leave for the courthouse, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. I answered cautiously. Olivia. Reynolds? The voice was unfamiliar, female, hesitant. Yes, who's calling? My name is Mia Chen. I think we should talk. The call I'd never expected, from the woman who had been unwittingly placed at the center of our conflict. The turning point had arrived, but from a direction none of us had anticipated. I'm listening, I said, signaling Elise to wait. Not over the phone, Mia replied. Can we meet? There are things you should know, things about Tom, about the Lake Tahoe house, about plans that were made that I wasn't fully aware of until recently. I considered my options quickly. This could be a trap, a strategy developed by Tom to gather information or create a scenario he could use against me. But it could also be genuine. A woman who had discovered she was being used as a pawn in someone else's game and wanted to reclaim her own agency. When and where? I asked. There's a coffee shop in Pike Place Market called Morning Brew. Noon today? I'll be wearing a red scarf. I'll be there, I confirmed, ending the call. Elise looked at me questioningly. That was her? Tom's girlfriend? Yes, I said, already processing the implications. She wants to meet, says she has information about Tom's plans that I should know. It could be a setup, Elise cautioned. It could be, I agreed, but it could also be the key piece we've been missing. Either way, I need to hear what she has to say. What about the hearing? Rebecca can handle the initial proceedings, I decided. This is potentially more important. Tom wouldn't expect his girlfriend to reach out to me directly. It's outside his carefully controlled narrative. The hearing on Tom's petition would proceed without me, but with Rebecca fully prepared to present our case. Meanwhile, I would meet the woman Tom had planned to build his new life with, the unwitting catalyst for the dissolution of our marriage. Whatever Mia Chen had to tell me, it represented a turning point, a moment when all strategies, all carefully laid plans might need to be reconsidered in light of new information. I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with high-stakes legal maneuvers, a clarity of purpose that had defined my professional life before I set it aside for Tom. Let's go, I said to Elise. I need to be at that courthouse for the start of the hearing, even if I leave early for the meeting. The game was changing, and I needed to be ready to change with it. The courthouse hummed with quiet activity as Rebecca, Elise, and I arrived for the hearing. We had barely settled at our table when the bailiff announced, "All rise. The Honorable Judge Isabella Ramirez presiding." Judge Ramirez, a composed woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and piercing dark eyes, took her seat and surveyed the room. Her reputation for cutting through legal theatrics and focusing on substantive issues made her both respected and feared among Seattle's legal community. I've reviewed the petition and response, she began without preamble. Mr. Wilson, your client alleges the trust amendment was executed without his informed consent through Mrs. Westbrook's undue influence. Is that correct? Garrett Wilson rose, projecting confident authority. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Westbrook placed his trust in his wife to handle certain paperwork related to their vacation property. She exploited that trust by inserting provisions he neither approved nor understood. Ms. Chang? Judge Ramirez turned to Rebecca. Your Honor, we've provided documentation demonstrating that Mr. Westbrook was not only aware of trust arrangements, but was actively planning to use similar mechanisms to shield assets from marital distribution. The amendment was properly executed, witnessed, and recorded 6 months ago. Mr. Westbrook signed the original trust document granting Mrs. Westbrook amendment powers. His claim of ignorance is contradicted by his own documented expertise in using legal entities to protect assets. Judge Ramirez nodded, then turned her attention to Tom's side of the courtroom. Mr. Westbrook, your professional background includes significant experience with property transactions and complex legal structures, correct? Tom stood, the picture of respectful deference. Yes, Your Honor, but in my architectural practice, not in trust law, I relied on my wife's legal background and our mutual trust. And yet, Judge Ramirez continued, you were simultaneously consulting with offshore banking specialists about shielding assets, according to Exhibits C through E. This suggests sophisticated understanding of financial structuring that contradicts your claim of naivety regarding the trust amendment. I watched Tom's face as he realized the judge had already seen through his narrative. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features before he regained his composed expression. At 11:30, I quietly informed Rebecca that I needed to leave for my meeting with Mia. She nodded, fully prepared to continue without me. As I slipped out of the courtroom, I heard Judge Ramirez saying, Mr. Wilson, I'm having difficulty reconciling your client's claim of ignorance with these email exchanges. Pike Place Market bustled with its usual midday energy. Tourists photographing, the famous fish throwers, locals navigating the crowds with practiced efficiency, the mingled aromas of fresh seafood, flowers, and coffee filling the air. Morning Brew sat tucked away in a corner of the market, its windows offering a view of Elliott Bay beyond. I spotted Mia immediately, seated at a corner table, a vibrant red scarf around her neck. She was younger than I had imagined, perhaps. Early 30s, with sleek black hair and the poised demeanor of someone accustomed to professional settings. She looked up as I approached, recognition and wariness crossing her face in equal measure. Olivia? She asked, half rising. Mia, I confirmed, taking the seat across from her. Thank you for reaching out. She nodded, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth despite the mild day. This is unconventional, I know. But after everything that's happened, I felt I needed to speak with you directly. I appreciate that, I said, studying her. There was no malice in her expression, just a complex mixture of anxiety and resolve. What did you want to tell me? She drew a deep breath. First, I want you to know that when Tom and I became involved, he told me you two had already separated and were moving toward divorce. He said you'd agreed to live separate lives while maintaining appearances for professional reasons. The familiar lie of unfaithful spouses everywhere. I wasn't surprised, but I appreciated her honesty. And you believed him, I said, not as an accusation, but as an acknowledgment of a pattern I'd seen countless times in my legal career. I did, she admitted. Until last week, when he sent that text to you about moving me into the Lake Tahoe house. He showed it to me proudly, like he'd finally managed some victory. That's when I realized you had no idea about us, that everything he'd told me about your marriage was a lie. She reached into her bag and removed a folder, placing it on the table between us. But that's not why I wanted to meet. It's about the Lake Tahoe property and what Tom was planning to do with it. I opened the folder to find architectural drawings, detailed plans for a comprehensive renovation of the vacation home, transforming it from a family retreat into what appeared to be a luxury rental property. These are dated 8 months ago, I noted, examining the timelines and budgets attached to the plans. Tom has been planning to convert the Lake Tahoe house into an exclusive short-term rental targeting tech executives and celebrities, Mia explained. The projected revenue was substantial, enough to fund his real goal. She slid another document across the table. A business plan for Westbrook Signature Properties, a high-end architectural firm focused on luxury vacation destinations, with offices planned in Tahoe, Palm Springs, and Aspen. He was going to leave his Seattle firm? I asked, scanning the financial projections. Yes. He's been frustrated with the partnership for years. Too many compromises, too much focus on commercial projects instead of the high-profile residential work he prefers. She hesitated, then added, I was supposed to be the lead designer at the new firm. That's what he promised me. The pieces clicked into place with crystalline clarity. Tom hadn't just been planning to leave our marriage, he had been orchestrating a complete life transformation. New relationship, new business, new identity as a luxury lifestyle architect. And he had intended to fund this reinvention with assets from our marriage. There's more, Mia continued. When we couldn't access the Lake Tahoe property last week, Tom became different, angry in a way I hadn't seen before. He started talking about other properties, other assets that could be liquidated instead. What properties? I asked, suddenly alert. She pulled out her phone, showing me a photo of a document listing several properties I'd never heard of. Addresses in Palm Springs, Scottsdale, and Vancouver. He said these were investment properties held through separate LLCs, properties you didn't know about. I took a photo of the list with my own phone, my mind already processing the implications. These weren't in any of our financial disclosures, or the documents we'd uncovered through discovery. Why are you showing me this, Mia? I asked directly. She met my gaze with surprising steadiness. Because I realized I was being used as part of a plan I never fully understood. Because what Tom did to you, lying, hiding assets, planning this elaborate exit, he could easily do to me someday. And because... She hesitated. Because it was the right thing to do. As our conversation concluded, Mia shared one final piece of information, the name of Tom's private banker in Vancouver, who had helped structure the undisclosed property investments. It was the missing link that would allow Rebecca to trace the full extent of Tom's hidden assets. I returned to the courthouse, just as the hearing was concluding. Rebecca greeted me with a triumphant smile. Judge Ramirez denied Tom's petition, she reported. Not just denied it, but issued a scathing rebuke about attempting to use the court to validate deceptive practices. The trust amendment stands. We have more, I said, showing her the photos and information from Mia. Previously undisclosed properties and the banker who helped hide them. Rebecca's eyes widened as she processed the implications. This changes everything. If we can prove he deliberately concealed these assets during legal proceedings, the judge could impose severe sanctions, potentially awarding you an even greater percentage of the marital estate. I nodded, but my mind was already moving beyond the immediate legal victory to the broader resolution I now saw possible. I need to speak with Tom, I said. Not through lawyers, not in a courtroom or mediation session, directly. Elise looked concerned. Are you sure that's wise? It's necessary, I replied. We've been fighting through proxies and procedures, but with this new information, we need to have one honest conversation. It's time to end this. I texted Tom a simple message. We need to talk, in person, today. His reply came minutes later. My office, 5 p.m. The Westbrook Architectural Partners office occupied 3 floors of a sleek glass tower in downtown Seattle. I had visited countless times for firm events and client receptions, always in the role of the supportive architect's wife. Today, I entered as Olivia Reynolds, attorney at law, prepared for the final negotiation that would resolve our conflict. Tom's assistant, Jennifer, greeted me with professional courtesy, though I didn't miss the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. The entire firm must have been buzzing with speculation about our separation. He's waiting for you, she said, leading me to his corner office with its commanding view of the Seattle skyline and Mount Rainier beyond. Tom stood as I entered, gesturing to the seating area rather than keeping the power position behind his desk, a small but significant concession. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I think we're past the point where either of us needs to pretend politeness," I replied, taking a seat across from him. "We need to talk about the Palm Springs, Scottsdale, and Vancouver properties, and why they weren't disclosed in any of our financial statements." The color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like he might deny knowledge, but then his shoulders sagged slightly. "How did you find out?" "That's not important," I said. "What matters is that we now have enough evidence to take this to the next level, not just family court, but potentially criminal charges for deliberate concealment of assets. Is that really the path you want to follow, Tom?" Tom and I faced each other across the sleek coffee table in his office, the Seattle skyline forming a dramatic backdrop to our final confrontation. The setting sun cast long shadows across the polished concrete floor, a fitting metaphor for the end of our 14-year marriage. "Criminal charges?" Tom finally said, his voice strained. "Olivia, that's extreme. This is still a divorce, not a prosecution." "Is it?" I removed the documents Mia had provided and placed them on the table between us. Deliberate concealment of assets during legal proceedings, potential tax evasion related to the undisclosed properties, possible wire fraud in transferring marital assets across international boundaries without disclosure or consent. These aren't just divorce issues, Tom. He stared at the documents, particularly the list of hidden properties, his face cycling through emotions, shock that I had this information, calculation of his remaining options, and finally, a strange mix of defeat and something that looked almost like respect. "Mia," he said, not a question but a realization. "She showed you these." "She made a choice," I replied evenly. "Just as you did when you decided to hide these assets. Just as I'm making now by giving you one opportunity to resolve this without escalation to authorities beyond family court." Tom leaned back, studying me with new awareness. "You've changed," he observed. "No," I corrected him. "I've returned to who I always was. The woman you married, the attorney with expertise in property law, the strategic thinker, the person who values honesty and fairness. I never changed, Tom. You just stopped seeing me clearly." He was silent for a long moment, looking out at the city he had once thought he commanded. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its defensive edge. "What do you want?" "Full disclosure," I replied without hesitation. "Every property, every account, every investment, no matter how cleverly hidden, equitable division of all marital assets, including those you've concealed. And a clean, expedited divorce without further attempts to manipulate the process or outcomes. And in return, we keep this in family court. No referrals to tax authorities or prosecutors unless you continue to conceal assets or subvert the process." I leaned forward slightly. "I don't want to destroy you, Tom. I never did. I just want what's fair, what I've earned through 14 years of partnership." He considered this, the calculation visible in his eyes. "The Lake Tahoe property is governed by the trust amendment, which Judge Ramirez upheld today. It's legally mine." I paused, watching his reaction. "But I'm prepared to include it in our overall settlement discussions if all other assets are properly disclosed and valued." That caught his attention. The Lake Tahoe house had become the symbolic battleground of our divorce, his planned future. With Mia, his dream of a new architectural practice focused on luxury properties. The possibility of regaining it, even at significant cost elsewhere, was a powerful incentive. "How would this work?" he asked cautiously. "We meet tomorrow with Rebecca and Garrett. No junior associates, no additional counsel. You provide comprehensive documentation of all previously undisclosed assets. Our forensic accountants value everything. We negotiate a comprehensive settlement that includes all properties, accounts, and investments. If we reach agreement, we File joint motions to resolve all pending litigation and proceed with an uncontested divorce. And if we can't agree on valuation or division, then we continue through the courts, with the judge now aware of your pattern of concealment and the consequences that typically follow. Tom was silent again, weighing his options. The rational choice was clear, but I knew pride and ego were powerful forces, especially for a man accustomed to controlling every situation. Finally, he nodded once. "I'll have everything ready by 9 a.m. "Everything, Tom," I emphasized. "If our forensic team discovers even one account or property you failed to disclose, all offers are withdrawn." "I understand." He stood, signaling the end of our conversation. "For what it's worth, Olivia, I didn't plan for things to end this way." "Few people do," I replied, gathering my documents, "but we all make choices that lead us to endings we didn't anticipate." As I reached the door, he spoke again. "You would have been a formidable attorney if you'd stayed with it." I turned back to face him one last time. "I am a formidable attorney, Tom. You just never bothered to notice." The following morning, Rebecca and I arrived at her offices to find Tom and Garrett Wilson already waiting in the conference room, surrounded by folders, binders, and digital storage devices. "Full disclosure," Tom said simply as we entered. "Every property, every account, every investment, as requested." The next 12 hours were a marathon of forensic accounting, property valuation, and intense negotiation. Tom's hidden assets were substantial, not just the properties Mia had revealed, but investment accounts in Luxembourg, a partial ownership in a Napa Valley vineyard, and cryptocurrency holdings worth over $800,000. In total, the marital estate was nearly 40% larger than our previous assessments had indicated. Rebecca's team worked methodically through each disclosure, comparing against known information, verifying ownership structures, and establishing current market values. By midnight, exhausted but clear-minded, we had reached a framework for settlement. The terms were straightforward: an equal division of all marital assets, with specific properties allocated based on personal connection rather than strictly financial considerations. The Lake Tahoe house would go to Tom, but at a premium, he would retain additional liquid assets equivalent to 60% of the property's value. Our Seattle home would be sold, with proceeds divided equally. The previously undisclosed properties would be liquidated, with returns split evenly after tax implications were addressed. Most importantly, the agreement included a transparency validation clause, if any undisclosed assets were discovered. Within 5 years of our divorce, they would automatically revert entirely to me, along with significant financial penalties. "We have a deal," Tom said finally, signing the memorandum of understanding that would guide our formal settlement agreement. As we gathered our materials to leave, Rebecca pulled me aside. "Are you sure about the Lake Tahoe house? You had him cornered. You could have kept it." "I never wanted the house," I replied truthfully. "It was leverage, not a goal. Besides," I added with a small smile, "I have other plans." Those plans began to take shape the very next week as I signed the lease on office space in downtown Seattle. Not for a return to traditional legal practice, but for something more personally meaningful. Reynolds' property advocacy would focus on helping individuals navigate complex property transactions and disputes, with a particular focus on spouses facing potential financial manipulation during divorce. The firm would combine legal expertise with forensic accounting and strategic planning, a holistic approach drawn directly from my own experience. 2 months later, our divorce was finalized without further conflict or court appearances. The settlement we'd negotiated remained intact, with both sides honoring their commitments regarding disclosure and valuation. I received a text from Mia the day the divorce became official. "Thank you for handling everything with such dignity. I've moved back to San Francisco and restarted my own design practice. Some lessons change us forever." I responded simply, Build something that's truly yours. 3 months after that, I stood in the newly renovated offices of Reynolds Property, Advocacy, preparing for our official opening. The space reflected my personal aesthetic. Warm wood tones, comfortable seating arranged for conversation rather than intimidation, art selected for meaning rather than investment value, and large windows overlooking Elliott Bay. Elise had flown in for the occasion, as had Rachel from Chicago. They moved among the guests, a mix of legal colleagues, potential clients, and the network of professionals who would form the collaborative core of my new practice. "You've created something remarkable here," Rebecca observed, joining me by the windows. "From crisis to creation in less than a year." "The crisis was always going to happen," I replied, watching the ferries cross the sound below. Tom's deception, his plans for our assets, his relationship with Mia, all of that was in motion, regardless of my actions. The only question was whether I would be prepared when it surfaced or caught unprepared. "Most people aren't as strategic as you were," she noted. "They react emotionally rather than planning methodically." "Which is precisely why this firm needs to exist," I said, "to help people navigate these situations from a position of knowledge and preparation, rather than shock and vulnerability." The office celebration continued into the evening, but as the guests departed, I found myself drawn back to those windows, reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been days of doubt, nights of grief for the relationship that had once held such promise, moments of anger at the years lost to a marriage that had gradually hollowed from within. But through it all, I had reclaimed something essential: my sense of self, my professional identity, my financial autonomy, and most importantly, my ability to shape my own future. 6 months after the practice opened, I received an unexpected communication, an email from Tom with a simple subject line: "Your advocacy firm." Curious, I opened it to find a brief message. "I've been referring potential clients to your firm. People going through complex property transitions who need exactly the expertise you provide. Your website doesn't mention our history, and neither do I. Some good should come from our experience. Congratulations on building something valuable." I sat with that message for a long time, recognizing it as the closest thing to an apology Tom was capable of offering. Not for the affair, not for the attempted financial deception, but for underestimating me, for failing to see the capabilities that had always been there. I replied with equal brevity, "Thank you for the referrals. Some lessons benefit everyone involved." A year to the day after Tom's fateful 2:17 a.m. text about moving Mia into the Lake Tahoe house, I stood on the deck of my new cabin on Whidbey Island, a modest but beautiful retreat overlooking Puget Sound. Unlike Tom's architectural showpiece in Tahoe, designed to impress clients and industry peers, this place existed solely for my enjoyment and peace of mind. Elise had joined me for the weekend, both of us taking rare breaks from our respective practices to mark the anniversary not with bitterness, but with appreciation for how far I'd come. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked as we shared a bottle of wine on the deck, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. "Not the divorce, that was clearly necessary. But the years with Tom? Do you see them as wasted time?" I considered the question carefully, as I had many times over the past year. "No," I said finally. "I can't regret the path that led me here, even with its painful detours. I learned about resilience, about patience, about the importance of maintaining your core self even when someone else fails to see it. I discovered strengths I might never have found without being tested, and I built relationships, with you, with Rebecca, with others, that proved more genuine and sustaining than my marriage ever was." I took a sip of wine, watching a heron glide across the water below. Most importantly, I rediscovered my purpose, not just professionally, but as a person. The firm is helping people navigate exactly the situation I faced, but with guidance and support I had to build for myself. To lessons learned, Elise said, raising her glass. And to futures reclaimed, I added, touching my glass to hers, as the sun disappeared below the horizon. I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with defeating Tom or winning the divorce. The victory that mattered wasn't about property or settlements or even vindication. It was about reclaiming agency, the ability to write my own story rather than play a supporting role in someone else's narrative. Tom's text message about moving, his girlfriend into our vacation home, sent with such casual cruelty, such absolute certainty that I would be powerless to respond, had indeed changed everything. Just not in the way he had intended. In attempting to control the end of our story, he had inadvertently freed me to begin a new one, on my terms, with my voice, and toward a future I was actively creating rather than passively accepting. The deed to the Lake Tahoe house was in Tom's name now, just as he had always wanted. But the deed to my life, to my choices, my direction, my purpose, that had always belonged to me. I had simply reclaimed what was rightfully mine all along, and in that reclamation lay the most profound victory of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.